Hello, and welcome to, I'm happy to welcome you to the second of this year's Franke Lectures in the Humanities here at the Whitney Humanities Center. Each year, the annual Franke Lectures in the Humanities are organized in conjunction with an upper-level undergraduate humanities seminar. The lectures are made possible by the generosity of Richard and Barbara Franke and are intended to present important topics in the humanities to a wide and general audience. The fall 2021 Franke Lectures in the Humanities has been organized in conjunction with the Yale College seminar, Mass Incarceration in the Soviet Union and the United States. And it's a tremendous honor to present today's speaker. Khalil Muhammad is the Ford Foundation Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and Director of the Institutional Antiracism and Accountability Project. He is the former director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, a division of the New York Public Library and the world's leading library and archive of global Black history. He's the author of the award-winning The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America, and a contributor to a 2014 National Research Council study, The Growth of Incarceration in the United States, Exploring Causes and Consequences. He is currently co-chairing a National Academies of Sciences report on reducing racial inequalities in the criminal justice system. And I know that it's not an award, but I regularly describe this book as one of the most important books in the 21st century. It's about the United States, but it is, I think, maybe the best book, certainly one of the best books ever written on the misuse of objectivity, on the ideological misuse of objectivity. Khalil is a frequent reviewer and commentator in national print and broadcast media outlets such as the Washington Post, The Nation, National Public Radio, PBS Newshour, MSNBC, and the New York Times, which includes his sugar essay for the 1619 Project, also a remarkable piece. He has appeared in a number of feature-length documentaries, including the recently released Amend the Fight for America, 2021, the Oscar-nominated 13th, 2016, and Slavery by Another Name. Khalil is an award-winning teacher at Harvard and has received numerous honors for his commitment to public engagement, such as Ebony Power 100 and the Distinguished Service Medal from Columbia University's Teachers College. He serves on several boards, including the Vera Institute of Justice, Cure Violence Global, and the Museum of Modern Art. And just before I begin, I hand things over to Professor Muhammad. He's going to speak for 45 to 50 minutes. Then Professor Snyder and I, the co-teachers, conveners of the seminar, will talk with him for 5 minutes or so while you put questions in the question box. And then we will moderate the 45-minute to question session with your questions to Professor Muhammad. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you, Jason, Professor Snyder, to Anna, to all the people who support this lecture series. It's indeed an honor to visit this seminar series, as well as to be part of the Yale virtual community this evening. I have a lot of friends there, and indeed, Jason mentioning the work of the National Academies on a report on reducing racial inequalities in the criminal justice system. I'm also joined by Tracy Mears and Elizabeth Hinton, two friends and colleagues who are working very hard on this report. So in any case, tonight's lecture is both tied to the readings that the students have read, as well as some continuing thoughts of my own and borrowing from the work of some of my colleagues who continue to broaden our understanding of the punitive roots of U.S. society. And with that, I thought I'd open with a little bit of a context setting, drawing on newer scholarship by my colleagues Kelly Lytle Hernandez and Dan Berger about settler colonialism, and then launch into a bit more directed focus on the topic of tonight's lecture. So with that, I'm going to do just a tiny bit of reading and then walk through the material for this class. So in many ways, lots of people have been focused on the question of why the United States, at this moment in history, is the most punitive nation in the world. And of course, it's almost rote to say that by population, by per capita rates, and by expenditures, the United States exceeds all other nations in how many of its citizens, asylum seekers, and undocumented immigrants are under some form of criminal legal supervision. And over the past 2 decades, there's been an explosion of reports by government agencies, nonprofits, institutional advocacy organizations, so on and so forth, exploring the dimensions of what some would argue is form of capitalism. And while these empirical and comparative data on the size and scope of this system and its many quote-unquote clients will continue to lie at the heart of many of these reports, only within the past decade, I'd say, have people really begun to take history seriously. And so answering the question, which I think animates much of the seminar, why the United States, by comparison to, say, the Soviet Union, is so punitive, may be the most relevant question to answer, and not simply to document its size, scale, and scope. And the challenge of answering this question, making it perhaps the most difficult one to settle, is not the lack of various historical drivers or causes or even the range of possible philosophical explanations for how Americans have imagined crime, sin, human nature, and the utility of punishment going back to the Enlightenment period. The problem is, of course, that these historical and philosophical explanations have often been least credible or authoritative in explaining mass incarceration among policymakers. And this seems to me to be a larger problem about empiricism, about the relationship of criminal justice practitioners and their role in providing technical assistance, a kind of coziness that has emerged over the past 50 years with regard to the study of crime and criminalization and the actual practitioners in law enforcement courts as well as in corrections. And therefore, the disconnect between the primary knowledge producers of criminal justice and just about everyone else has grown wider. And so one of the legacies of this disconnection is the dismissal of history as an important tool to understand how we got here. That, as I've already suggested, is beginning to change. So let me set the scene, a kind of long history that I think helps to put my more immediate concerns for this evening's talk in context. From the beginning, the United States has been what the historian Dan Berger calls a captive nation. In the summer of 2019, of course, many people within the United States and in some places around the world commemorated the 400th anniversary of at least the landing of 20 or so Africans in Virginia. And that this moment represented a kind of attempt to reflect on the fact that in American history, there's no moment when European descended people did not use racialized forms of punishment, war, or containment against indigenous tribes, immigrants, or enslaved people of African descent. Settler colonists first used the logic of elimination, then turned to ideas of exploitation to make way for their permanent residency. 2.5 centuries before the nation was founded, and for nearly a century after, the core institutions of American democracy and economy were built on the land of the indigenous and the backs of the enslaved. As Dan Berger writes, quote, "Race, especially anti-Black racism, has been the primary modality through which this pairing of colonization and confinement has transpired in the United States. Forcible consignment haunted Black life from capture in Africa through the Middle Passage and sale in the Americas." And he continues, "Chattel slavery initiated a racial regime rooted in confinement. Plantation slavery was as much a carceral force as the early penitentiary. The historical institutions of native reservations and African American slavery were the most durable legacies of a number of ideas and ideologies that helped forge the punitive foundations of American society. The frontier myth of a virgin land waiting to be tamed and cultivated by a master race animated much of the colonial justification for native displacement and genocide. As generation after generation of white colonists and later citizens moved west, the choice to define native populations and Mexicans as, quote, savages or criminals by law, custom, or practice rationalized the eventual creation of the nation from sea to sea. that Europeans did not encounter the legal restrictions and physical constraints of the old world and turned to religion to justify conquest gave them a sense of legitimacy to what they called manifest destiny. Philosophers and political theorists from Adam Smith to John Locke and Thomas Hobbes helped justify conquest as the march of civilization. By the 19th century, a system of federalism had evolved, which maximized various states' monopolies on violence to ensure conquered indigenous and Mexican land would be converted to private property by whites and capitalized by chattelized black people. And so what is at stake in this early sketch, or this sketch of the early history of the United States, is precisely, and let me pause here and say this slowly, the lawlessness of the law itself. At all times, a white outlaw culture that rewarded brute force and strength of arms against racialized others unsettles basic assumptions about how we are to understand criminalization and punitiveness over time. That is, who is counted as criminal and to what extent the state has used violence or punishment. In Kelly Lytle Hernandez's recent study, City of Inmates, Conquest, Rebellion, and the Rise of Human Caging in Los Angeles, for which, among many other accomplishments, she won a MacArthur Genius Award, she found a remarkably stable pattern of criminalization and incarceration going back to a single carceral site in the Tonga Basin, once part of Mexico, named for the native community that originally occupied the land for 7 millennia. What is today modern Los Angeles, and here I'll begin to shift to this portion of the lecture. If someone could just let me know that you see only the slide and not a bunch of noise in the background, that would be helpful. But if you do here, why don't I do this? Sorry for the pause. I know this is always a little awkward when you're working with one screen. So you should see mostly the slide. What you see there is a depiction of a 19th century Los Angeles jail. And part of what you want to draw your attention to is the seamlessness with which the space of incarceration fits within the larger commerce and economy of this growing city. What she writes is that what is today modern Los Angeles, crime and punishment emerged as the platform for the racialized inequities established during the colonial era to flourish in the Republic of Mexico. By the 1820s, the new nation's jails, prisons, and convict labor crews were overcrowded with the historically marginalized of the old colonial order, largely a population of natives, Africans, mulattoes, and mestizos, she writes. As displaced or landless people, they were arrested on public order charges, ranging from vagrancy, disorderly conduct, and drunkenness. She notes that in order for manifest destiny to have become more than a proclamation or a simple fact of conquest by treaty, the law needed an infrastructure. And let me note here that the arc of time between charges of disorderly conduct or drunkenness, or what would later be called status offenses, will have a powerful resonance later in this lecture. She notes that the law needed an infrastructure. The local jail therefore represented the foundational structure, she writes, of U.S. conquest in Los Angeles. She continues, it was how the rule of law was established. By 1850, the city passed an ordinance that deputized all whites on complaint of any reasonable citizen. And of course, the very definition of citizen excluded the very groups who were being incarcerated, and established racialized municipal chain gangs and convict leasing nearly a generation before the end of slavery. And so let's talk about that moment at the end of slavery. And let's clarify a few terms that I think are helpful if they've not already been made clear in the context of previous discussions. We talk a lot about mass incarceration. I use the term racial criminalization, and I want to introduce a concept of mass criminalization that may be less familiar. And in this way, racial criminalization is simply defining or stigmatizing a racial group of people as criminal, regardless of guilt or innocence. Of course, there's a little bit of double use of the term racial here, but the point being that a racialized group of people can then, with the power of ascription, be defined as criminal, and it doesn't matter individual behavior. It is a form of collective guilt. Mass criminalization, and that is using law and policy to limit the freedom of a group of people regardless of innocence. And so here we move into what we will learn more quickly, is one thing to assign a stereotype to a group of people. It is another thing to use the force of the law to act on that stereotype. And then finally, mass incarceration. And this is an important distinction because mass criminalization does not, by definition, lead to mass incarceration. Indeed, what we'll learn in just a moment, or what you likely already know, is that the era of convict leasing in the South and the era of all-white juries after the passage of the 14th Amendment is a period of mass criminalization. The law is intended as a form of racial control or social coercion within a political economy of punishment. The point is that people will accept their second-class citizenship, or they will accept the coercive regimes of sharecropping or tenant farming or other forms of extractive work, having little to do with putting as many people behind bars. Where the population we're talking about in the mid to late 19th century, in fact, the infrastructure of the jail itself was less substantial than was the prison farm or the private lease. But most people simply didn't serve time at all. They were scared into accepting their second-class lives, working as free labor on a cotton farm or cotton plantation. And so, of course, the 13th Amendment, which has come into lots of scrutiny, both for activists calling for new amendments to strike the clause of punishment for crime, but also some scholarly scrutiny for a question of whether the Congress or the radical Republicans intended to make the 13th Amendment a kind of hollow gesture. Nowhere in my work have I ascribed that intentionality to the 13th Amendment. Although I don't write about it, it's certainly acknowledged that this kind of legal language or legal loophole for forms of social and civil death had been key to the notion of hard work as a form of punishment and labor, even when prisons were racially disparate in the opposite direction in the early 19th century, where they were simply all white prisons. But that doesn't change the fact that in the context of the South in the postbellum period, Southerners made quite creative use of this loophole for their own purposes, and enshrined in a set of laws known as black codes that African Americans would be subjected to an entire body of legal jurisprudence that would be at its core anti-black and intended to be so. The context of this is also a kind of political revolution that brought with it new justification for ideas. And these ideas are very important because the interplay of the use of various forms of coercive criminal justice practices, including the leasing of people to private industry, or the threat of punishment as such, also was wed to a narrative of blackness that quickly attached to new forms of data, essentially to make the case. But I wanted to highlight here that the ascription of criminality as a new form of justifying oppression is also the ongoing control over power, the control over the power of political representation and participation, which of course would come with citizenship and eventually be legislated by virtue of needing to pass another amendment, that is the 15th Amendment. And here we just hear the voice of one of the key writers of this period, Hinton Rowan Helper, essentially warning the nation of what happens if black people get to vote, and that their criminality is the basis for that disfranchisement and that distrust. Negroes with their crime-stained blackness could not rise to a plane any higher than that of base and beast-like savagery. Helper presented his collection of expert opinions as an archaeologist uses fossils to reconstruct some prehistoric creature for the world to behold with gratitude that it no longer walks the earth. In Helper's case, the caption for posterity read, "Terrible things await a nation bent on handing ballots to beasts." Seeing then that the Negro does indeed belong to a lower and inferior order of beings, why in the name of heaven, why, he pleaded with his readers, should we forever degrade and disgrace both ourselves and our posterity by entering of our own volition into more intimate relations with him? May God in his restraining mercy forbid that we should ever do this most foul and wicked things. Now I know you've read chapter 2, this comes from chapter 1, but it helps to establish the baseline for the ways in which the notion of savagery also led to extralegal violence. And so if in the context of the postbellum period, have been the context for an explosion of the use of the criminal justice machinery, or as Kelly Lytle Hernandez has already suggested to us, the infrastructure of the jail as a coercive instrument, so too were forms of racial terror. And here is just one slice of looking at documented cases of lynchings across multiple states. This number continues to change as researchers continue to find new examples. The range, of course, many people now know was very arbitrary acts of transgressing the social norms of white supremacy in the South. Because as much as the exploitative regime of sharecropping was intended to use the threat of punishment to coerce people, it also was wrapped in the notion that people's own dignity was a threat to those forms of oppression. The simple fact of communicating across the color line, walking with one's back and dignity, wearing a uniform of World War I, extended the range of the kinds of things policed, both initially. And so we began to accumulate not just the evidence of racial terror, which often was read as evidence of a Black transgression or of a crime committed by a Black person. In the most extreme examples used to justify lynching was the accusation of rape, of Black male rape of white women. And so we began to produce statistical evidence out of what today we call criminal justice contact, police contact, convictions, arrests, these sorts of things. And so now, with the distance of hindsight, no one within the sound of my voice would likely say, well, of course, that was all objective state activity, and therefore the numbers were a helpful guide to understanding the levels of antisocial behavior within the Black community. But I'd caution you to so easily judge those who articulated this point of view in the past, because it's precisely the durability of this notion that crime statistics have a kind of truth value to them that has helped not only to justify the way that the South first and then really at a national scale organized around these issues. And even saying the South first is complicated because the treatment of antebellum African Americans as a criminal class even preceded the postbellum period. But at scale and within the context of national debates about the relative fitness of Black people for citizenship, we first get to mass emancipation in the period after the Civil War, and then new kinds of tools that take place, new kinds of demographic questions and concerns. This is the heyday of eugenics. Population studies are happening in the Western world, in part to figure out how to manage and contain the movement and the aspirations of the global South as we would recognize it today. And so Nathaniel Shaler happens to be a popularizer of history, a person who's writing for the Atlantic Monthly, the same magazine that exists today with the same kind of approach and tone, which is to kind of bridge the gap between social science and policy and important questions that people are trying to answer with empirical data for popular audiences. And so as a Harvard paleontologist, he was a naturalist. He had no particular skill set for this kind of work, but took it on as a translator. And in his first article on this topic, he essentially turned to statistics as a way to resolve a kind of problem. And that problem was articulated by Helper, which was to say that many people assumed that Southerners had a kind of bias towards ascribing criminality and other racist stereotypes about Black people, that they were primitive and that in the position of being free, they were retrograding to their quote-unquote ancestral condition. I don't want to get too much into the present right now, but just simply to say that Northerners had the reputation of being sympathetic to Black people. And in the postbellum period, these sectional divisions about whose knowledge was most authoritative on this question of the appropriate place that Black people would fit in the social and political hierarchy of the nation came to be resolved by new forms of data. And I'm dwelling on this point for just a moment longer because it's precisely the eugenics period where the notion of objective crime data or IQ tests or birth rates could all be forms of knowledge production that would help policymakers and elected officials and other decision makers to make sure that they organize society in the most productive and efficient way. And so out of the statistical data that Nathaniel Shaler was calling for, it came the first turn towards the U.S. Census in 1990. This census is an important milestone because it represented a perfect generational cohort for looking at the health and welfare of African Americans who had been born outside of slavery. So if you're born in 1866, for example, or in the winter of 1865, you've never, quote unquote, been touched by slavery. And you could essentially compare the health, mortality, morbidity, crime rates of people who had never been enslaved to those who had been. This kind of comparison didn't actually happen in the way that I've described, but general claims did occur, meaning that people took to the 1890 census as the first authoritative census after the Civil War. One, sampling techniques were problematic in 1870. Also, there was now what the famous writer Thomas Dixon Page, who was the novelist whose work The Klansman became the basis of Birth of a Nation, he and others called the new issue. And the new issue was a younger generation of Black people. Remember, someone like W.E.B. Du Bois is born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts in 1868. He represents the new issue. He represents a person who sees the possibilities of his full humanity as being unchecked and undiminished by claims of white supremacy. And essentially this animates his entire life and corpus of academic work. The other new issue, of course, is all those entrepreneurial and aspiring Black people in the South who are moving with freedom and mobility in the South and challenging, again, the norms of white supremacy, of which we saw the reaction, both being defined as criminal and sometimes literally being lynched by a lynch mob. And so the 1890 census produces this new source of administrative data that points to a snapshot in time that the population of African Americans is now 12%, but they represent 30% of those that could be counted as prisoners. The raw numbers are roughly 82,000 total prisoners, of which Black people are about 22,000. Within the 22,000, about 90% of them are men. Now, because this is a critique of these data, the point is not to dwell on those particular statistics to check their veracity. It didn't really matter, because people who turned to those statistics for the first time, who made use of those statistics, who saw themselves as innovative in an effort to pick up where Nathaniel Shaler had left off by calling for statistics as a way of measuring the true racial capacity of Black people, one of those figures was a man named Frederick Hoffman. And in his work, Race, Traits, and Tendencies, which is really a work about health differences and health outcomes, because in his day job as an actuary, as the leading actuary for Prudential Insurance, his job was to make predictions about life and death so that insurance policies could be priced accordingly. He also had a particular concern about making sure that working class white people, including immigrants like himself, he was a German immigrant, would get a fair deal, because he recognized that both nativism and segregation of limited housing opportunities, limited mobility, various forms of state-sponsored discrimination directed towards immigrant populations was causing a problem for them. And Hoffman's innovation in this moment is to single out African Americans, to lift them out of what might have been, and I'm not arguing a counterfactual, simply arguing that the debate that emerges around Hoffman's work, what might have been a robust sociological or ecological argument about the nature of premature death in the modern city. What essentially he wanted to say was that many immigrants are suffering from exogenous social forces, but Black people are not. And to make his point, he made what we call a white supremacist argument today. He essentially argued that Black people, by dint of behavior and biology, faced only two options in the race of competition with white people. That is the avenue, a road to prison or to an early grave. And he was using the data I just showed you of the disproportionate representation of Black people in prison as evidence for it. Now, of course, you know that the political economy of punishment, which we've already established, makes it nearly impossible to know how many Black people were truly, quote unquote, guilty of a crime and deserving of punishment. What we do know is that generalized notions of the structural forces contributing to crime was an increasingly popular point of view pushing back against eugenics claims. And so here Hoffman himself clearly positions himself as someone interested in progressive solutions to the problem of crime and other forms of antisocial or community-based harm. He writes 4 years before Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro. The study of statistics of suicide, madness, and crime is one of the utmost importance to any society. When such an increase has been proved to exist, it is the duty of society to leave nothing undone until the evil has been checked or been brought under control. The heaven must come of the wealth of the people. We must be far from true lies as long as we permit to exist or accept inevitable conditions which year after year drive an increasing army of unfortunates to madness, crime, or suicide. It is the struggle of the masses against the classes. I like to joke that if Bernie Sanders needed a speechwriter to illustrate the excesses of capitalism and the harm that it does to people, this metaphor of an increasing army of unfortunates would resonate very powerfully with concern about the premature death of white people suffering from both deindustrialization and the opioid crisis. So Hoffman was not alone. There were others, such as the Socialist and Progressive Labor Party member Harry Vrooman, writing in the same magazine, also before Race Traits, in an article called Crime and the Enforcement of Law, that the whole problem of crime as today expressed in society is summed up in the problem of poverty. We have churches enough, schools enough, moral sentiment enough to regenerate the world in a decade were it not for the awful pressure brought to bear on 9/10 of the human race, which all but forces them to be vicious. And so I want to establish a clear line that in Hoffman's own formulation of the use of crime statistics, we have two divergent explanations. That the data of the overrepresentation of people in criminality, when applied to white people and European immigrants in particular, represents the evidence of social forces, of the structural economy, of the excesses of capitalism, which is why these people are self-identified as socialists and progressives who share this point of view in common. But Hoffman argued just the opposite for African Americans, because as a racist and racialist project, Hoffman pursued the data to make the argument, or I should say, to make the data fit the argument. Here he notes prison and race statistics from Chicago, Philadelphia, Louisville, and Charleston, and from states including New Jersey and Pennsylvania, confirm the census data and show without exception that the criminality of the Negro exceeds that of any other race of any numerical importance in the country. So let's just take that first part of the statement at face value. It is true that that the evidence of the disproportionate participation in the criminal justice system at the arrest level and in the confinement level show the highest rate of disproportionality. But if we were to take the same logic as has been applied to various white communities, not by the eugenicists, but by the progressives and socialists, we say those are the people suffering most from the structural disadvantages that happen in society. But instead, Hoffman said just the opposite. When the Negro learns to respect life, property, and chastity until he learns to believe in the value of a personal morality operating in his daily life, the criminal tendencies will increase. And so this notion of Black criminality or racial criminalization then happening in massive form takes on a life of its own. And to use a concept developed by Barbara Fields called Racecraft, essentially the notion that new logics, new racial logics or ideologies of race are grafted onto ongoing projects of racial control and power. And so in here, the case is the degree to which Black people are pursuing educational opportunities becomes an argument against their further education. There is essentially all sorts of magical thinking happening here, which is why I love this concept of racecraft that Barbara Fields comes up with. But here's an example. The Mississippi governor, James K. Vardaman, who is one of 11 Confederate governors with former Confederate states, and minces no words about the degeneracy and inferiority of Black people. This is not a nuanced circumstance. But what's fascinating here is he does, in fact, feel the pressure to defend what is happening in Mississippi on the basis of crime statistics. And so as much as there is a robust, muscular white supremacy happening on the ground, there is still this growing appetite and need for a kind of national agreement that Southerners may not be so bad after all if they can all agree that the crime statistics tell the story. And so here Governor Vardaman says, to school the Negroes to increase his criminality, official statistics do not lie, and they tell us that the Negroes who can read and write are more criminal than the illiterate. In New England, where they are best educated, they are 4.5 times as criminal as in the Black Belt, where they are most ignorant. The more money for Negro education, the more Negro crime. This is the unmistakable showing of the United States Census. So I want to disrupt the easy way with which we might throw the governor into a bucket of because even the governor wanted respect. He wanted this form of propaganda to be heard as a way of justifying policies that were meant to be modern and future-oriented, and not like his pro-slavery ancestors. In the same way that we learned a lot about in international comparisons about the ways in which 20th century forms of segregation and colonization are drawing on new ideas, or at least ideas that are newly ascendant. And so the Black sociologist Kelly Miller, who's at Howard University at the time, it takes this argument on directly, as does Du Bois in the study of the Negro problem, where he points out Hoffman's biases by showing that there's an appetite within the nation to accept without criticism these early pronunciations of Black people as forever doomed to be criminal. I'll talk a little bit more about that in another example. But here Kelly Miller takes on this exact argument at face value. He says, okay, here's the argument. Where legal processes are acknowledged to be fair, that is in the North, in New England, for example, where the Negro has the fullest educational opportunity, which was more like fuller rather than fullest, he shows a criminal rate 3 to 4 times as great as his ignorant and oppressed brother in the South. And the conclusion is hastily reached that education makes the Negro a criminal, which of course is a justification for rolling back educational opportunity. So Kelly Miller then goes on to say, well, okay, if Black men are 5 times more likely in the state of Massachusetts to serve time than in Mississippi, maybe Hoffman and others are onto something. But what if white men are 10 times overrepresented, which it turns out to be the case? And so he asks this question, did education make Northern whites criminals too? Or shall we foster the bliss of ignorance only when it is found under a Black skin? As you know from your reading, Du Bois takes on similar arguments by pointing out in various European cities across from Munich to Breslau to other places, rates of quote-unquote illegitimacy and prostitution are higher than is true for Black women. You also know that as much as Hoffman places his target on the backs of Black men, he also uses illegitimacy rates and the sexual transmission of venereal diseases as evidence, essentially the statistical equivalent for Black women as sexually degenerate. And so these swirl of arguments of crime rates and illegitimacy rates contribute to what is happening on the ground in cities across the country. In Atlanta, a race riot emerges in 1906. A French journal captures the scene in this illustration. And what comes out of that is a powerful example born out of the work of Addie B Wells. From your reading, you know Addie B Wells witnesses the lynching of 3 of her friends who run a grocery store. Out of that, she commits herself to defending their honor and to challenging the racial terror of her hometown, Memphis, Tennessee, because she used her printing press to tell their stories. Her printing press is ultimately burned down, and she leaves town one step ahead of a lynch mob. She lands first in Philadelphia, on to Chicago, where she will dedicate the rest of her life not only exposing the lies of white supremacy, but building an infrastructure of social service and political activism for Black women in the club women's movement. She's an early founder of the National Association of Colored Women, so on and so forth. So she's got this incredible career. But she takes on these arguments about lynching because having borne direct witness to its toll on Black people, she is one of the first African Americans who are challenging the use of crime statistics to make an argument about Black inferiority. In this example, she happens to be at a fundraising dinner in Chicago, where a speaker has just talked about the recent events in Atlanta. And a white woman named Mary Plummer, who's a suffragist, leans over to her and says, "I don't know what we can say about this terrible affair, but there is one thing I can say, and that is to urge all of you to drive the criminals out from among you. Have you forgotten that 10% of all the crimes committed in Chicago last year were by colored men, less than 3% of the population?" It's a remarkable moment because it shows that the disproportionate evidence of criminal justice contact for Black people becomes a justification for the instrumental use of racial terror and violence. Two things can be true at the same time. Never mind the fact that we can't trust that there isn't bias in the use of laws directed toward African Americans in Chicago at this time period, which we'll talk about in just a few moments. And so within the body of work that Addie B Wells is involved in, her most seminal work, Southern Horrors, which you've also read, is a fascinating example that at no point in these histories that we are telling did Black people not speak back to the ideologies and the behavior that contributed to premature death and the justification of it. And so in this study, she does a sample of Chicago Tribune. She reads them, as you well know. I liken her approach here, a form of investigative journalism, like the Washington Post or the Guardian, keeping track of police killings because the nation is not keeping track of it. And so she wants to uncover the myth of Black men as rapists as justifications for lynching, which you also know in your reading of Frederick Hoffman simply counted every lynching as evidence of a Black rape, which by his own standards, actuarial standards, simply wouldn't hold up to peer review, so to speak. But nevertheless, Addie B Wells says in the preamble of this work that out of their mouths shall murderers be condemned. And she goes on to debunk the rape myth. Now, of course, my colleague Crystal Feimster at Yale has done wonderful work in pointing out that this rape myth is as much a form of sexual control over the behavior of white women. And so we have to think about the gendered implications of white supremacy, both as directed towards Black women, but as well that this myth also functioned as a form of sexual and social control over white women's sexuality as well. She debunks the myth by noting that only 31% of even the allegation in those newspapers was of rape. And she also goes on to debunk the myth of Black female licentiousness. In this way, she inverts a racial narrative by reporting on white male rape of Black women. And among the many stories that she tells one in particular of a Nashville man named Pat Hannafan who had outraged a little colored girl. And for his crime, he was in fact sentenced to 6 months in the city jail, but upon release became a city detective. And this is not just our 2021 sense of outrage at the hypocrisy in this. The story is in her book in 1892 precisely because she understood it as outrageous as well. Nathaniel Shaler, who was a self-described friend of the Negro, a liberal at the time, who essentially asked this statistical question in 1890, which set a lot of this in motion. A decade later, starts to evaluate the evidence that's come in, and he takes a much more centrist moderate view that perhaps even out of the work of Addie B Wells, he was inclined to believe that the problem of rape on the whole was more a problem of white male rape than Black male rape, noting there is less danger to be apprehended from them in this regard than from an equal body of whites of the like social grade. And so within this constellation, I want to turn our attention to, for a few minutes, how this moves. So this is material that comes from chapter 3, not out of chapter 2. Because the continuation of the story of Hoffman's impact on setting the terms of how to judge Black people's fitness for citizenship is also borne out by the legacy of Hoffman and others in pointing to European immigrants and low-income white people as being worthy of citizenship because their crime was not disqualifying. And in this way, studies like this of Frederick Bushy on ethnic factors in the population of Boston highlight the criminality of the Irish and Italians. There's a moral degradation among Irish families for quarrels, which are a serious affair, for flashes of anger, which mean a knife thrust when someone go to the Italian quarters. These are both expressions of the kind of racialized logics that apply to European immigrants, but these are arguments in favor not of further criminalization, but of assimilation, which is itself a form of violence. But within this context, the point is not to be punitive, but to incorporate people through fairer distribution of public goods. And so people make the argument that these are Americans in process, these are fellow passengers on our ship of state. Hoffman himself engaged on this point, but again, his agenda was to single out Black people as exceptional by comparison to the Irish, and exceptionally worthy of divestment and not investment. Du Bois, as you know from your reading, went to great lengths to expose the hypocrisies and contradictions of Hoffman's work and the body of work that came from it. He was roundly and consistently dismissed as being biased towards his own people, including University of Pennsylvania sociologists saying that Du Bois had a chip on his shoulder because surely his accomplishments were evidence not of white supremacy, but of opportunity in the country. Pretty remarkable. And so here Du Bois, who's frustrated by a decade after writing The Philadelphia Negro in an essay called The Souls of White Folks, very expressively describes the circumstances of this contradiction. Murder may swagger, theft may rule, prostitution flourish, and the nation gives but spasmodic, intermittent, and lukewarm attention. But let the murderer be black or the thief brown, and the righteousness of indignation sweeps the world. It is blackness that is condemned and not crime. If it isn't obvious, that's where the title of the book comes from. Others looked at these contradictions and began to give voice to them. Here's an editorial from the NAACP pointing out, as I like to say, the two men, the white man to the left of the nattily dressed man, as well as the black man to the right of his counterpart, are our equivalent of people sagging in the early 20th century. These are people who are marked by a class identity within their race, which makes them suspect. And the point here in American logic is that white people see this as individual failure, whereas American logic, white people see a black man whose class position makes him proximate to criminality as evidence of the race, which is racial criminalization. If they had that language at the time, that's what they would have called this. And so that logic leads to a predictable outcome. On the ground, in the work of progressives, so the set of ideas to justify reading crime statistics as evidence of social, economic, and political inequality then leads to arguments such as this. And this illustration from a prisoner reentry organization in Chicago describes the scene of a mother raising her children, potentially alone. It's not clear if her husband is in prison or down the street or absent altogether. What we do see is that she has 5 kids. She's got a lot of babies. And so within the context of eugenic concerns, she shouldn't have had all those babies in the first place. But for progressives, the problem here is that she lives in a community of poor people with broken windows, and that leads to juvenile delinquency as 2 kids are fighting in the street. Every poor community or immigrant slum in the early 20th century in a place like Chicago also has some kind of saloon or bar around the corner. It's hard to see in this image, but it's the sign here where my mouse is. And of course, every bad neighborhood then and now has some, over population of police activity. And here some cop is dragging some guy off the street. But rather than make this a call about personal responsibility or chastity and morality, as Hoffman did, these progressives in Chicago made this an issue about a larger structure. So long as there are bad tenements, sweatshops, brutal policemen, bad jails, child labor, dishonest and grinding employers, saloons and gambling dens, so long as boys are taught to fight and allowed to carry firearms, so long as fathers are indifferent deserters and mothers must maintain the family by the washboard, so long crime will continue. What will you do to help this association to prevent it? And this story plays out time and time again. Jane Addams is the leading social worker of the period. She has tremendous power and influence as a middle-class white woman social reformer. She writes several books. She redefines the problem of community harm and juvenile delinquency and social dysfunction. not just as a problem of society and the mistreatment of youth, but also not as one that is attached to immigrant status or even attached to nationality. She is decriminalizing and deracializing the problem of white youth criminality, because the statistics she's facing are overwhelming. 15,000 youth brought before the juvenile court in 1904. She's talking about white kids. She describes them as stealing from their parents, swiping junk, pawning their clothes and shoes, doing, quote, any desperate thing to get the dope, as they called it. She describes daily acts of violence, of interpersonal violence, as was true in the case of this example of people using firearms. So, the point is, I'm showing you the primary evidence upon which we can see up close how this is playing out. And she also argues that so a Polish youth shot an Irish boy in the head. This tale could be duplicated almost every morning. What might be merely a boyish scrap is turned into a tragedy because some boy has a revolver. And she adds, we certainly cannot expect the fathers and mothers who have come to the city from farms or have immigrated from other lands to appreciate or rectify these dangers, nor could we expect the young people themselves to kill the cancer of modern city conditions. This is Jane Addams' entire corpus of work, and that corpus of work is also echoed by the University of Chicago in its ecological approach, which saw immigrant criminality and poverty, or immigrant crime and poverty, as evidence of the groups, and the solution to that was to disperse them into communities with greater opportunity to lift up their economic base and to engage in various forms of police reform and other things. Her work was praised for being even poetic within the bounds of sociology, which would be a rare thing today. But of course, people do win Pulitzer Prizes, which I guess is kind of the equivalent for writing a great work of ethnography, such as Matt Desmond, so on and so forth. Just to illustrate very quickly, these politics of knowledge and the violence of racial quantification are also showing up in Black conservative voices. Booker T. Washington is one expression of this, perhaps not as harsh as this one. This is a man named William Hannibal Thomas, who you also were introduced to from your reading. He says that he's writing to sociologists in the country because he has firsthand experience of what he's seen. And as a Black man, he can testify with certainty that that it is true. Black people are degrading into a savage behavior. They are savage at heart, unable practically to discern between right and wrong, intrinsically inferior type of humanity, a record of lawless existence led by every impulse and passion. Really, the inferiority of the Negro in mind, morals, judgment, and character is such that there is no doubt that some very plausible confirmatory evidence of the justness of the simian theory of human origin might be derived from a close inspection of his demeanor. That's a mouthful, but he basically said that he's convinced Black people really are closer to apes and monkeys than they are to human beings. Of course, he wrote this around the same time as a young man named Otabenga from the Congo, literally placed in the Bronx Zoo on display in the monkey cage. So that Hannibal Thomas actually did not present the kind of statistical evidence that one could expect of such claims in the way that both Hoffman used them, and even James K. Vardaman, the Mississippi governor, is surprising, because one would have expected that his book would have simply been ignored by academics, but it wasn't. In fact, by Franklin Giddings, a towering intellectual within the social science community, the founder of Columbia University Sociology Department and the third president of the American Sociological Association, praised William Hannibal Thomas's book as a sociological study. It is one of the most valuable things to be put in the hands of genuine students of American conditions that I know of. Presents his subject without an atom of the sentimentality, which is so often proved a blemish in many books, otherwise most excellent. And so we've just seen an example where one is praised, in the case of Jane Addams, for sentimentality. And yet Hoffman, a Black man who is written without any of the structural rules of social science, is praised for being objective because he is a member of the race. The New York Times also gave it a rave review. And so to close, the echo of this moment leads to what will continue to be various forms of redlining, of instrumental violence, of police control, and eventually police taking on the work of maintaining the second-class and segregated lives of Black people outside of the South. This is a scene from the Chicago race riot. I won't dwell on it. We can talk more about it in Q&A. Black people in defense of themselves are searched and stopped and disarmed Out of that report came a number of recommendations. These recommendations I won't read in this instance, other than to say that they recommended, led by a black sociologist from the University of Chicago, that crime statistics themselves ought to be jettisoned because they were overly biased and were giving bad or false information, evidence of their inaccuracy and misrepresentation. And a leading criminologist agreed in 2 editions that these statistics were completely unreliable. I'm going to skip over this example in the interest of time. We can come back to it. So we could ask the question, what happened to Bush's Italian and Irish criminals? How many Italian Americans committed armed robbery last year, Irish American burglars? Or in this case, we can't know, right? The answer is that those statistics disappeared. The fact of their disappearance is the evidence of the way that this use of crime statistics, as Professor Stanley would describe as a form of propaganda, continues to drive discussion and debate about the fate and future of black people. Edwin Sutherland noted that one of the reasons why they stopped counting the Irish and Italian Americans is because they appeared to approach the same kind of behavior as white Americans, native born, which is to essentially say, as long as black people could be singled out, or Mexicans or Chinese Americans or Chinese immigrants, for having excessive crime rates, it didn't the crime. And just to show you, this is crystallized in Uniform Crime Reports, which to this day are the most authoritative form of arrest statistics as an indice of crime in the nation. In 1933, when they began, they pointed out Negroes and the foreign-born should be watched. By 1940, it is significant to point out that the figure for native whites includes the immediate descendants of foreign-born individuals. This is a form of statistical white flight at precisely the moment where white flight is, in fact, beginning to happen in parts of the country. The Kerner Commission picks up on the same recommendations as the Chicago report, which is why I didn't read those in interest of time, but they essentially amount to better treatment of citizens, more police protection, because one of the other sides of the coin of racist policing is also under protection. They call for independent citizen review boards, a stop to aggressive patrol, develop community policing. A lot of this should sound familiar. So familiar that even for Kenneth Clark, who was famous for having done Dahl studies and contributing to the end of formal segregation in the '54 Supreme Court decision on Brown versus Board of Education, notes that he'd read the Chicago Riot report, he read another one in Harlem in 1935, another one in 1943, and that added that he kept reading the same recommendations and that it must be a kind of Alice in Wonderland with the same moving picture reshown over and over again, same analysis, same recommendations, and same inaction. And so here we are with Bloomberg and Comstat, the overrepresentation of black and Latinos relative to white in the era of mass incarceration, the ongoing use of violent crime rates. The notion here is that because crime dropped, incarceration must work. You see an inverse relationship with stop and frisk. This was the defense of stop and frisk as a massive system of racial control and police discrimination that was ultimately ruled as such in 2013. And what I wanted to show you here is what collective guilt looks like, because the long legacy of Frederick Douglass is articulated by the former police commissioner in New York, Ray Kelly, who notes it doesn't mean that people are not doing anything wrong to the question of stop and frisk racial profiling. If you look at the statute, it says reasonable suspicion that individuals might be about to commit a crime. There's a preventative aspect to this. People say innocent. That is not the appropriate word. That's what collective guilt looks like. And then he notes this is standard law enforcement practice around America. I won't dwell on this, but this comes back to the same kinds of infrastructure of criminality that we saw in Kelly Lytle's work: drunkenness, disorderly conduct, public urination. The scale of Latino and black stops produced little more than summonses when people were stopped, but 90% weren't even issued so much as summonses, because the vast majority of people were stopped for things that were not, in fact, crimes. Ferguson had the same problem. We know from the result they resorted to racist ideas to justify it. And so I'm reminded when we go back to the racial terror era of lynching that when we look at police consent decrees since 1995, there are about 70 of them. This is just a partial list. It kind of looks the same, right? It looks like how we might look back on this moment and see the same tally of state violence in this moment as similar to state violence in the lynching era, which of course in the lynching era was defensible. And yet we're still having a debate about the defensibility of state violence in this moment. And so I close with one final echo, and that echo is that we could read the evidence of opioid death in the nation in this kind of data visualization that the New York Times did a few years ago with the evidence of wide-scale death. Not too much of a leap to note that that death itself is wrapped up in various forms of illegal drug consumption and distribution and related crimes that go along with it. And yet we are to understand as a society that this tally of death in white America is evidence of a public health challenge. And Chris Christie articulates this quite clearly. Addiction is an illness that we can beat if we give the people the tools and support they need to overcome this disease. If we choose to free people from the stigma of addiction and recognize it's a public health challenge, it truly is, we can help people to reclaim their lives. Think a great army of unfortunates. We can find the true measure of our compassion. The investment we're making will change lives and get more people into treatment earlier instead of the emergency room or prison later. So this is a call for disrupting the social conditions leading to premature death in white America. And with that, thank you so much for following that along. Look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Khalil. And I loved your adding, New York Times also gave it a rave review. History does not change. So Tim, do you want, so first of all, I want to say, everyone, place your questions into the Q&A. And I will start collecting the questions, and we'll moderate them as they start to roll in. So let's begin. Tim, do you have?
I mean, I had a thought, Khalil, that I'd like to share with you and see if you've had a similar thought. In your book, you raise the tantalizing possibility, which we can't know, whether Frederick Hoffman had read Addie B Wells and whether in some sense he was responding to her. And I in reading these two primary readings, which Jason assigned along with your book, I was struck by a really strange structural similarity that led me to think of what Hoffman was doing as a kind of like scientific lynching. And the reason I'm thinking about this are two elements that I draw from Addie B Wells. The first is, she points out that what a lynch mob is doing is basically discrediting the state. I mean, a lynch mob is saying these people don't deserve the law, and by saying that, you're basically pushing the state out of the picture, right? You're pushing the rule of law out of the picture in the conventional sense. And the other thing she's doing, which seems rather courageous, or was courageous, is that she's drawing attention to the gender or the sexual aspect of it, right? And then if you read the whole Hoffman thing, you can look at what he's doing as this as kind of the same thing that she's criticizing, but on like a much more, in this empiricist way, in this scholarly way, because he's arguing, not like a lynch mob would say one black man did something on the basis of hearsay or rumor or whatever, and he's saying the whole black race does things, right? And he's doing it on the basis of this kind of sketchy reading of evidence, but it's like it's the same move. And then there's the same conclusion, which is that these people basically don't deserve the law, right? They're outside the law. Maybe the state should act to protect other people, but the state shouldn't act to protect them. And there's this weird dichotomy, which you emphasize in your talk, where Hoffman is basically saying the state should be giving white people good conditions for existence. Meanwhile, it should be social Darwinism for black people, right? This funny thing. But then there's also this gender component too, right? I mean, Addie B Wells is hinting, she's suggesting pretty openly that there's an element of white male anxiety about all this, right? And and Hoffman has an answer to that. He's saying, look, they're going to die out, right? Like they're not, they're going to die out. And like, and when he was saying that, I was thinking of like the performative part, some of the nastier performative parts of lynching, right? That when you say that a race is going to die out, you're also going, that's an argument about manhood, right? I mean, they can't keep it going, right? They're going to die out. So reading these things together along with your marvelous work, I was struck by this kind of odd structural similarity between the way Addie B Wells describes lynching and then the way that Hoffman goes about describing crime.
Well, I think that's one of the things that is surprising in examining Du Bois's work as well. Du Bois is stuck trying to essentially argue against racialization by using the same disparity data that everybody else is using. He doesn't have any more evidence than the same sets of quote unquote facts about disproportionate arrest rates in the city of Philadelphia, for example, except he has a different interpretive lens for how to explain what's happening to Black people. So your point about the symmetry with which these arguments are constructed is partly why this period is so important, because we're stuck with the same form of the argument about what to make of, this, what I would call statistical artifact, right? A statistical artifact is a trace of a set of interactions, a set of power relationships, a set of events, and what to make of those events. As you point out rightly, Addie B Wells is seeing all sorts of things that, as you point out, white male anxiety. She's seeing different forms of victimization on different scales, but essentially it's the same, which is the evidence of either a lynching or a rape that is the linchpin of the entire discussion.
I have a bunch of questions. I'm going to try to hold them tight. So one of the, let me see where to begin. So first of all, is it right? Do I have it right from the understanding of the policing literature that one of the things they did in response to Irish and Italian American crime was to make Irish and Italian Americans police?
That's one way to put it. I think the motivation wasn't to solve the crime problem. The motivation was patronage. It was a form of distributing public goods, and in this case, civil service jobs. Right. Let me just qualify that with one additional note. In all of these groups, in these liminal transitional spaces between being the target of policing to being part of the police, was usually a moment when some Irish guy gets hired to then go be like the special forces guy for rooting out Irish crime, or the Italian guy who does the same. I mean, these histories are really fascinating because we can, I've forgotten the guy who was the first Italian American who infiltrated, the Sicilian mob in New York City. And then there's Samuel Battle, who's like the first Black person who's assigned to Harlem. So there's a little bit of truth to what you're saying, but that, I think, at scale, it was more about distributing civil service jobs, of which policing was one part of it.
But did they do something similar with Black Americans?
Well, they did
make them into police
like. Yeah, well, this is why your question, why I answered your question about political patronage and opportunity structures rather than about crime control, because in the case of Italians and the Irish, they moved into these positions, what I'd say, at scale, whereas for Black people, they didn't move into these positions at scale. Right. They were tokens. They were, a little bit of inside intelligence for helping to solve certain crimes, but in some ways they were a tiny sliver of patronage. So we never saw the same upward mobility as a kind of form of political patronage for Black people that would have positioned them to simply be the last immigrants to join the force, if we were to use that metaphor.
Great. Okay. So two more quick questions, and then I will. So one, I just want to check my teaching of Hoffman. I regularly teach Hoffman just because, I think it probably holds the same fascination for all of us. The way the objectivity. He believes he's objective, yet it's so clearly, it's helpful that Hoffman sometimes, to remind yourself, he's arguing that Black people have less vital force than white people, and you have to remember there's no such thing as vital force.
Right. Yeah.
But this massive statistics, what you have, the core of so many of Hoffman's arguments are these claims that in this context there's no racism. So he says, look, in the North, we know there's no racism. In the South, there's racism, but in the North, we still have these disparities. So therefore, these arguments of, oh, well, this is a group that doesn't, of Black people, that doesn't face anti-Black racism. That seems to me core to racist arguments, like not seeing the effects of racism. Like now with the disparity in COVID deaths, Hoffman would quickly conclude, oh, Black people have less vital force, they have less. But now people don't make that error. Like, well, clearly that's environmental.
Well, there are still medical scientists and researchers who are, literally still searching for the last remnants of DNA that might reveal the fundamental differences in health outcomes. So, the colloquial version of this is that we're 99% the same, and some people might say 99.9%, but damn it, if that 0.1% won't tell the whole story, that's kind of how it works.
So, and we see the same exact thing with IQ debate, right? We see the same, like people say, oh, Black kids adopted into white families eventually do have an IQ deficit, but they don't face racism. Right. Yeah. Because the assumption that so there's an echoing of Hoffman's arguments throughout modern. I was wondering if
I would just
go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the things that as a writer I tried to do, and this might be a curiosity to your students. I wrote about Hoffman as someone who couldn't, my job wasn't to pass judgment on Hoffman in analyzing his text. And one of the ways that I focused on doing that was to write from the perspective of him looking forward rather than us looking backwards. And I give him a lot of credit for his ingenuity and innovation and his willingness to defend his point of view and to search for the evidence wherever it led him and could find it. In a way, that's Du Bois's project also. Just to come back to Tim's earlier point, Du Bois leaves Philadelphia and goes to Atlanta and spends a decade turning over every stone he can to take seriously. Maybe there is some evidence that Black people have a particular predisposition to, various kinds of pathologies. He doesn't find it, and he gives up. And the only reason he gives up is because the deck's stacked against him. His arguments don't sit within a milieu that is inclined to read any form of Black disadvantage or failure or death as evidence that there's something wrong with Black people. So to your point, the climate in which academic research and various debates about racial disparities today animate a lot of academic research. And it tends to be a little bit more disciplinary in terms of who's on what side. Economists tend to be more on the side of individual agency. It's a science of individual and rational choice, so that's not entirely a surprise. And sociologists tend to be more inclined to take the structural argument, but there's heterogeneity in both sides, and sociologists weren't always as open to these exogenous arguments about Black people.
I'm just going to follow up quickly and then hand it over to Tim, and then we'll go to questions. That's a great point because it brings out the thing that's most one of the things that's most criticized in the current anti-critical race theory moral panic, which is you're impugning objectivity, and you've just brought out brilliantly. I once had a Facebook argument with Glenn Lowry, who was like falling into this. Oh, well, there's objectivity and neutrality. And I was like, wait, so economics doesn't have an ideology. And, and he was like, oh, yeah, okay, you're right. Like what a discipline is an ideology, like, as you just pointed out. But this is all being, what's happening, this point that any statistics, any interpretation of statistics is going to bring with it is going to be viewed through an ideological lens, is being attacked as an attack on science and objectivity.
That's right. Yeah.
Tim?
There's a dialectic there which is similar to the dialectic I wanted to mention before we turn. The dialectic is, if you believe that you're the kind of person who's always objective, that's a very deep form of subjectivity.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. Yes.
And there are a lot of folks in these debates who think that they are the kind of people who are always objective.
That's right. Yeah.
Right, which is a marker of their subjectivity.
Yeah.
I wanted to say something similar about the law, because I was really struck in your presentation and the way you went back and forth between the sources, and also in the Ida B Wells Southern Horrors, with an issue that I see when I write about colonialism and actually about Nazi crime, which is this notion that we as a people are so legal, right? We are such people of the law that we can tell when it's okay to make an exception, right? Like we are by definition such legally minded people that if we carry out a lynching, that ipso facto, that must have been justified, right? That state of exception must have been justified. And you see that state of mind with the Germans in Eastern Europe. I mean, it's very similar, like this notion that we are obviously of a higher legal status than the people we confront. And because of our legal knowledge, we know that it's okay to make an exception.
That's right.
We know, because we're such legal people, we know which people are outside of the law. We know when we can make an exception.
Yeah. Can I just echo that? I mean, I wanted to make that point in the sort of preamble to the lecture about the foundational lawlessness of the law itself, and to really nail the point of a white outlaw culture embedded within a legal culture. Yeah. That on the face of things, possible to square these contradictions other than in the way you just described. And perhaps a more controversial analogy would be that white collar crime and financial crimes in a culture that we have today is very much about rewarding people who can break the law and get away with it. And there's a kind of culture of admiration and respect for it, because if everyone's playing by the rules, then no one's going to make any money because the market is going to adjust perfectly to perfect knowledge. We all know the same thing, then we're all competing at the same level. But it's precisely the moment at which I can exploit information, which is often illegal to exploit that information, that I can make money. And maybe we catch these people, maybe we don't. I remember hearing a survey of self-reported crimes by financial sector elites saying, basically, have you witnessed or know of a crime being committed within the context of your work? And I'm just going to guess what I heard at that moment, and people can look it up. But, it was a large number. It was well over 50% said, yes, we've seen this all the time. And that's just the point, right? The rules are made to be broken by powerful people, only to reinforce that they're the right people to be in control of the law.
Okay. Oh, excellent. So we've got a bunch of questions. One of them feeds right into the Muhammad worldview, and one of them is the main critique you always get. Which one do you want to start with?
Let's start with the critique.
Okay. So one of our students took Professor Philip Goff's course, and they're talking about, and of course, Professor Goff is statistics are going to be used, and it is. So this student wants to say, how do we grapple with the tension? Have you ever heard this question before? How do we grapple with the tension between simply knowing racism as a truth of our existence versus using statistics as a way to prove our reality to those who don't experience it, that is, white people?
Yeah. So I think this is a question saying, do we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater?
Right.
Right. So, I don't have a good answer for this question any more than I had a decade ago when I first wrote this book. What I can tell you is that other people who study comparative societies that are rooted in settler colonialism or colonialism, South Africa, Brazil, France, essentially tell stories or have shown that in societies where there is little administrative or empirical data to trace racial disparities, communities have had a harder time, who are the victims of systemic racism, in making the case for those experiences. And therefore, one could argue that the other side of the coin of racial criminalization vis-a-vis crime statistics has been robust social movement activism in defense of Black people's civil and human rights, essentially using the same evidence against their oppressors. And I don't know that I can solve for that history anymore by acknowledging that contradiction. But if the question is, how do we move forward? It seems to me that that's less an answer about whether we get rid of racial crime statistics as some kind of early warning system and get ours to re-socialize ourselves to a more universal understanding of the very outlaw culture that I've just described. To borrow Tim's work here, in a country that has, used forms of memory laws to prohibit deep socialization and learning about the things that we are supposedly never to forget, we keep forgetting the same histories over and over again and producing similar outcomes in our society. That to me seems to be a first order problem before we can decide whether or not using race as a way of measuring social phenomena is no longer useful in our society.
Good. So, okay, now let's flip, continuing on the theme of objectivity. So here's a question on the misuse and weaponization of objectivity in modern America. And this is another, again, a student in our class. We have a mixed audience of public and students. So here the question is, how do you think crime data is weaponized in debates about policing in major cities, especially with regard to increased use of algorithms and widespread use of surveillance technology? Okay, that's a bit of a softball down the plate.
No, it's a great question. And I wrote a new preface to Condemnation 2 years ago, and I had thought I might read a little bit from it, but I didn't. But essentially, a couple years ago, by way of anecdote, Bill Bratton announced CompStat 2.0 at a conference that I was attending in New York City. It was a Future of Cities conference hosted by the Rockefeller Foundation. And he bragged about CompStat 2.0 being more predictive and not prejudicial, more discriminating and not discriminatory, because this new algorithm of hotspot policing was going to pinpoint exactly the right criminals in the community, sweep them away, and make communities safe again. And so he even jokingly said something to the effect that it was like Minority Report, the Tom Cruise movie, where these precogs, short for precognition, could predict the future, see a crime happen, and then they'd send the police out, Tom Cruise, for example, to stop the murder before it happened. And so I write in the preface that this notion of a Minority Report as a film is a double entendre, a pun on the notion of a Minority Report focusing on Black and brown people. So to answer your question, for much of policing today remains committed to the hyper-surveillance of Black communities predicated on the notion that the statistics show that there's lots of crime in those communities, and therefore policing ought to remain at the levels that it has historically been and ought to be the primary instrument for delivering public safety. Now, you didn't read this in the book, and I talked a bit about it in the lecture for this obvious reason, that if we are to take history potentially as some guide to what might be possible in the present, and people can disagree about whether that can happen or not, policing was never the solution to all the antisocial behavior in the white community. It's not now, and it wasn't then, after we got through with the eugenics period and the period of nativist reaction to immigrants. So the response was social investment. So we seem to be stuck on allowing law enforcement to define its bureaucratic imperatives as our moral imperatives. And therefore, it's going to use its evidence as best it can to make its argument, which is to continue to point to crime statistics as the proof. But aside from everything we might say to complicate what does a crime actually mean in a social context, we use Tommy Shelby's work, my colleague, who makes a very sophisticated argument that, as a philosopher, essentially says we can't judge the crime in the community if we can't deal with the crimes of the state. And so, anyway, we could go down the road there, but that's my reaction.
Yeah. just an aside, it's just so incredibly frustrating, is undersells it, to see this repeat itself again and again. Professor Hinton's first book is on this topic, the removal of social. She's speaking later in the seminar. We're reading both of her books. The removal of social aid and support and just criminal solutions, and again and again and again
and again. Yep.
I won't ask you what people ask me. What's the solution? All right. So another question. One of the audience members is curious about Hoffman's legacy in terms of the emphasis of law and order and the war on crime some 60 years later. So now we are getting into Hinton's work.
Well, could I, well, unless there's an add-on to that question, there is an interesting footnote that isn't obvious from what they read.
Oh, go on.
Yeah, so very quickly, Hoffman, it couldn't be more interesting as a as a writer. So, it might have been good enough to read this book, to put it in this historical context, and to see his contribution to the way that we have this conversation today. That's that's the point of chapter 2. But it turns out that Hoffman is such a seminal figure that his study of homicide in the country makes him a sole source authority on national homicide statistics until the 1920s. It really is until the federal government the need for nationalizing the collection of crime data that Hoffman is the #1 source for making claims about who's dying where in what parts of the city. And he's so credited for it that he's award-winning, so on and so forth. But one quick note, his longevity is so significant, and his place in this sort of social economy is so significant that the National Urban League, a civil rights organization, invites him to a conference in the 1920s to basically give the statistics on homicide in Black America, because that's, if you want to know who's dying and of what, he's the guy. And Du Bois is either there or gets wind of it, and he, proverbially pulls his hair out, because he's like, this guy won't go away. I cannot get rid of him. So to the questioner's point, Hoffman lasts much longer than the 1890s when this book is published in his significance.
So I noticed in Alden Morris's book, A Scholar Denied, when he was describing Du Bois's conferences in the Atlantic, they looked a lot like year-by-year responses to Hoffman's book. Is that right? I mean, do you know?
I don't know.
One is on disease, one is on...
Yeah. I mean, I would say that a lot of academics build their careers frustrated with some body of work that they want to take down. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that Hoffman was a consummate foil for Du Bois.
Right, that makes sense. Right. So this, but to continue the question, the person wanted you to draw parallels between the 1960s, the era, the front lash era, as it were, to borrow Veshla Weaver's terminology, and Hoffman. So how do you? Yeah.
Well, I'll just say that, and I'm going to draw on my former IU colleague's work, Nicole Siegel, who's written a book called Violence Work. Mm-hmm. And what's fascinating about that work, a rich archival study, is to look explicitly at the relationship between the academic community of criminologists and the clinical practice of law enforcement, and that these two things bleed into each other beginning in the 1960s. And so there's a kind of technocratic consensus between a body of academic research and basic law enforcement that there's no room for any critical distance. Essentially, the academic community is a handmaiden to the law enforcement's need. They need them to tell them, how can we do our jobs better? How can we be more effective at this work? And while this might not be entirely a surprise, it neutralizes and mitigates the kinds of critiques that come from other academic pockets and other kinds of research, such that law enforcement is not accountable any. They can point to the very research community that they are both getting funding from federal sources increasingly to do this work. And so everybody, in the way that Hoffman is, can argue for empiricism as the currency for policymaking that is fundamentally discriminatory and is causing so much social activism that, of course, Elizabeth is writing about in her second book.
So here's the next question, also from a seminar member. Given the perception that, quote, education makes the Black person a criminal, unquote, how can we understand the process of reformation within the 19th and 20th century prison systems? That's what we've been going chronologically because it's a history class, and that's apparently how you guys roll. We philosophers. So we've been talking about, we've read Foucault. We've talked about. We started with Austin Reed's book, and we've been looking at Reformation. So the question is, how does so there's moral reformation through religion and physical reformation through work, but how does this discussion of education increase criminality play into prison reformation discussion about intellectual reformation in the late 19th and early 20th century? Is the result, I guess, to build on the question, is the result that the Reformation discussions in prison and in prisons in late 19th and early 20th century exclude teaching, exclude prison? I mean, it's really interesting because I'm tempted to go to the eras I know in the 90s and removing prison education, which happened in the 90s. As if that, was not, as if education was not important to Reformation at all. But is that a theme that in late 19th, early 20th century, was educational, intellectual Reformation frowned upon as a result of these discussions?
So let me cut to the first argument, or the first bit of evidence, and then back into that question. So first of all, what is happening in the context of Reformation does not apply to the vast majority of African Americans who are still Southerners in the late 19th and early 20th century. The prison scholars, including Rebecca McLennan and others, see the broader period, say between 1870 and 1920, as a progressive project, in Rebecca McLennan's words, as a kind of effort at manly citizenship. But it is thoroughly racialized in the direction of what is required to give white men a second chance through the incarceration experience. Mostly that is about work. So there is still, a carceral regime of extraction from men in the name of rehabilitation. But increasingly, they get the kind of programming that we would recognize in more modern times. They get to publish newspapers. They get, various forms of arts and entertainment, theater productions. There is informal education that I'm aware of, and I've studied this period pretty well in the way of people getting GEDs, for example, but anything's possible. And so I don't want to exclude that just because I can't recall that being part of it. So there is a kind of series of intellectual nourishment that comes through the arts and other kinds of writing forums for people who are publishing newsletters in these places. But these are places that house 80% white populations. There are, small numbers of incarcerated people of color in Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles in these early days. Maybe not so much Los Angeles. Let me hold off on that precisely because of Kelly's work. But in the places that I've looked at these histories, that's what it looks like. It's the South that is, literally the Dark Ages, and there's no effort to educate anybody. So what I point to in the presentation and what you heard has everything to do with the larger justification for, at best, a sharecropper's education in the South. Because too much education would give people the tools to question society, and therefore that was not consistent with the racial project of control.
Right. It's kind of truly remarkable when we think about what happened in the 90s when they removed funding for prison education. That was the 1990s.
Yeah. Well, that was austerity, right? So that was a version of neoliberalism, pointing to punitiveness as a public good, without encouraging forms of dependency or form of dependency, and that is for the state. And so you could invest in more punishment as a form of incapacitation and maybe the logic of deterrence, without making good on any other possibilities, like pulling Pell Grants, pulling programming for education inside.
Okay, so maybe we have time for one more question. Let's see. So we have a couple more questions about Black education, but I think we've I mean, one general question. Let me see what question to close on. Well, do you want to talk about the legacy of, maybe tying some of these themes together? I'm going to just jealously ask you to end on this because I'm really interested in this whole idea that I'm interested in the modern sort of racism, this stereotype that Black Americans are anti-education or view education as white. The has been disturbing me of late, and so the question was, how does this legacy of criminality in education fit into have a bearing on contemporary discussions of Black people and education?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of them, but there's one I skipped over in the presentation. So in the interest of efficiency, which of course is a major theme in these arguments,
right.
I'm going to show you something I skipped over because I think it gets at a little bit of this. So there's a section of the book, it's not in the chapter the students read, where part of the rationale, part of the emphasis of the book and these echoes is that so much of what we might easily dismiss as white supremacy required so much effort at a performance of objectivity. People wanted to be taken seriously. People wanted not to be dismissed as racist. And that tendency today to turn to empirical evidence to end an argument or to resolve a debate is the same tendency to say, I'm not a racist. Black people commit more crime than anybody else. It's a fact, right? That's the structure of the debate. And so part of the structure of the debate that we carry with us is that people having this debate about how to explain these disparities 100 years ago was to then say, okay, well, maybe we should look, if education really works, if education really is just about opportunity and we just need to extend more opportunity and that will be the answer to these disparities, I'm talking 100 years ago, then people started looking at the criminal records of the alumni of various schools, HBCUs. Theodore Roosevelt did it at Hampton and Tuskegee, as you know, Jason, from having read the book. And it's remarkable. Booker T. Washington writes an article about it. He's basically saying, you can count the alumni of HBCUs and just a handful, can be counted in criminal records. And what's interesting is there's no equivalency that I ever found amongst various immigrant populations that had shared this similar container of criminalization for a time. In fact, I'm not the only one who pointed it out. A guy named Ray Stannard Baker, who was a liberal progressive at a time, that wrote a book called Along the Color Line. And this was probably one of the more progressive books that could kind of point to a lot of contradictions. It's cited in Condemnation. And he pointed out, he said, look, we keep counting like what happens to Black people in these schools as some kind of evidence of whether or not the school itself is important or useful. when we don't do the same for places like Harvard and other places. And his point is that if we started to keep track of the criminality coming out of mainstream elite white institutions, and if we did an economic analysis of it, there would be untold damage done to individuals and to society by virtue of the alumni behavior coming out of these schools, right? Like, you know, every financial crime that has nearly destroyed the economy on a scale of damage to individual lives is incalculable relative to someone who's a victim of pickpocketing, burglary, or something else. And by the way, homicide is a tiny part of criminal offenses, about 5% violent crime. So most of what is crime and causes us to have mass incarceration is not killing somebody, but something else, and often something quite petty. So I point out that economists today are still using that framework. They're still judging whether a school is working or not based on the crime rates of Black kids who attend them. It's crazy. It is totally absurd, as if the value of the public good itself ought to be judged against whether or not people engage in criminal activity. Because what we essentially is closing off is the possibility that there is nothing but association, and there is no causation. And essentially, the drivers of antisocial behavior and criminality are separate and apart from whether or not kids are have that school experience. But this is a legacy. You know, I won't give it all to Hoffman, but he most certainly advanced the argument directly with regard to African Americans.
So on the note that Harvard, Yale, and Princeton lead directly to crime, yeah, which I found that right.
Yeah, I mean, imagine a roster. I mean, you know, I'm not an economist, but you could just take kind of the most celebrated white collar crime of the last 50 years, actually, you know, names, sentences, crime itself, and then do an estimate on the actual damage to people's lives, including people killing themselves because they lost a job, or they, however it plays out.
Or a house.
Or a house, you name it.
Or a mortgage, and all the violent crimes that resulted from.
Or domestic violence driven by economic challenges, which is I'm not the social scientist per se, but this is a major argument of social science, that domestic violence is often a consequence of the difficult economic realities that men in particular face. So yeah, I mean, so that's the point. The choice we make for the data we collect and the arguments we make about it is an expression of power itself. And so, hopefully our students will learn that and they will use their power wisely.
On that wonderful note, thank you so much, Professor Muhammad. Khalil, that was wonderful. Thank you for your vital work.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope to see everybody in person one day.
Yeah, we would like that.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.